Hi, and welcome back. Our next presenter is Sarah from LeanIX, and she's going to be talking to us today about junior developer interactions with API documentation. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Hi, welcome. So we're just getting your slides up on the screen there. Looks good. Could you actually make that full screen for us so that we can see it?
Okay, but then I don't see the timer. So
that's okay. I'll pop on and let you know when you're up with time.
Okay. But where did I lose it now? Okay. Hi, my name is Sara, and today I'm gonna talk about the junior some of the interesting interactions that I've seen in my workspace. I work on a product where we try to manage the cost of the SaaS, and my team, which is where most of the people started the juniors job, is to try and integrate with thousands of them. And that can lead to some of the pretty interesting interactions that we have. And I want to talk to some of them to maybe, to maybe get you to see what the potential problems can be with the documentation. I want to first talk about the location of the documentations. A lot of cases that we actually see is that somebody would advertise that they have an API, but it's not available either publicly. When you log in, you cannot find it. And when you send an email, there is just documentation doesn't exist. There was actually an interesting case when we tried to find it, and we figured out even the subdomain that they were using for the API, but without the documentation, we couldn't figure out how we would actually log into it because none of the normal login things like in the query strings or the bearer tokens or basic authentication would work, even though we found something that looks like an API key. There was even another situation where we once found a public documentation, but we were then told that it's outdated and we should use a new one, but the new one didn't exist anywhere, which was a pretty interesting thing. And for the junior developers, that is really confusing because they don't generally understand yet the differences between the business goals and the developer goals. And we generally have to teach everybody that sometimes people advertise the thing that they don't actually have. The next situation that a lot of API documentation required the domain knowledge. When I joined, I once didn't find an information that how to get some of the data from the API that they were providing, but they didn't document it a lot. And I remember one of my team leader basically told me, oh, you just go on a call with the customer and the customer is going to tell you how you connect to this service. All you have to make sure is that you listen to them and they'll tell you everything, which was a pretty weird developer experience because that's definitely what happened on the next call. A lot of, especially the enterprise API documentation require a lot of implicit knowledge that none of the junior developers will ever know. My favorite example of this is that there is a service which allows you to query all the data as long as you know the table names, and they don't provide any way to actually get the table names or any list of the possible table names that you could possibly query. One interesting thing about the implicit knowledge is also usually with the GraphQL APIs. The problem with the GraphQL APIs for the junior developers is that the mental model that requires you to use the GraphQL API generally has to be a lot more developed than, for example, for the REST or some of the other ones. And what I saw in my experience is that a lot of times when there is gonna to be a GraphQL API, what the juniors do is just copy an example, even from documentation, or if documentation doesn't have them, from the internet, and then try to change one thing at a time and hope it will still gonna work. A lot of time that also means that a lot of times the data is limited by the objects, because having the connections to work between objects for a junior developer tends to be a harder job than expected. Which is actually interesting, because from the other perspective, for junior developer, using the SDKs actually ended up being harder than just raw HTTP, for actually a pretty similar reason than the GraphQL. What actually happens is that every SDK generally have their own syntax, and it has their own ways of how to get the data, while the HTTP calls are generally always the same, and they have an easier time copy things for the raw HTTP calls than they have it for figuring out how the SDK code works. And that also means that if there is a bug, I can see that they can be pretty quickly productive if the old code is written in HTTP calls, but for all the integrations that we have in the SDK, they generally need like days to just get familiar with the code. Another thing that I realized, some of the services have different base URLs depending on whatever they're region dependent, or sometimes they're plan dependent, and so on. And I can see a lot of confusions because there's generally not a lot of information of which one to choose, or at least not the information that they can be confident that their choice is going to work. I could see the cases where there's, for example, a list, we have these three regions, pick the base one, the one depends on a region, but it just confuses them, and sometimes on the end they're just like, I'll try all of them and see which one it works. And that's actually how the code actually looks like. Sometimes the API documentation has also the descriptions of the methods, which I found very redundant, because the question is usually then why don't the HTTP methods then actually show how the data is, how we actually get the data. We generally only use read permissions, so multiple times we had to answer a question: why are we using a post methods when we only read the data? And on the end, we generally told them, yeah, we know post methods are generally to send the data there, but just think of it this way: post has a body and the get doesn't, because it's a lot better differentiation for in the practice purposes. And we generally told them to ignore whatever the different API documentation that describes the methods, the HTTP methods like that actually say. The next one, a lot of times the API documentation would also describe the HTTP codes that they're using. The interesting pattern that I saw is that generally, if they have a regular use of an HTTP codes, they'll describe it. And if they have an irregular use of the HTTP codes, they won't. And there are a lot of really interesting cases of the HTTP codes. For example, there are multiple cases where the APIs would return, for example, HTTP code 400 for non-authenticated cases, or even a better one, they will return 200 and give you back the HTML of the login page. And there are also some obscure one where for unauthenticated cases, they would either put something like something in the range of the HTTP codes 500 for which would generally mean that the server is not available and not that you are not authenticated. And I would really prefer if the people that use the regular HTTP codes would maybe not have to include it, but the one that use irregular one, I would really prefer if they would include it, because these are always the surprises. You really don't want to be surprised that you get back HTTP code for unauthorized, and then in the body it's like you have a rate limit, so wait a bit and then it will work. A lot of question is also about the OAuth applications. OAuth standard, for example, does have a password grant and credentials grant, but for the junior developer, this is not generally what they consider an OAuth. So there is always an explanation needed if, for example, the documentation advertises they use as an OAuth, but they use as a password grant is that this is an OAuth, and yes, it doesn't have a refresh flow and tokens in quite the same way you're used to. But the most interesting case was once the documentation basically told us that an OAuth, the tokens are going to be long-lived and there is no refresh flow. But one of the junior developers that we had said, well, that's an OAuth. It has a refresh flow, and the refresh flow worked, even though the documentation wouldn't. So sometimes you also have cases when documentation doesn't agree with it. And the code still works after a couple of months. So not entirely sure. So I guess this was just a case of they're implementing something that they didn't document it yet. The next one is authentication. If you use some really weird authentication, then, for example, I once had something that required a personal certificate, and then you take free values out of it and combine them something, then please make sure that the code samples work, because if they don't, then there is no way a junior developer could figure out how to use that type of authentication. But otherwise, if it's a normal one, from bearer tokens to different headers to query parameters to basic authentication or anything else, it's usually okay. Just say whatever it is that they should be using. And the last one that's pretty weird is junior developers trust the documentation, that what it's written in the documentation, it's what they'll actually get back. So in some cases, we then ask them, okay, but in this case, we see that we get a different response, and they always go back to documentation to try to figure out why. And in some of the cases, the documentation never provides that answer. For example, I remember one case when for some of the customers, we got back the plan data, and for the other ones, that attribute just wasn't included in the JSON. And in some case, once we would get the data and suddenly there would be like 0, even though we could see from the other API responses that this shouldn't be the real value. And in both of the cases, we actually didn't get any information from the documentation. And because junior developers generally just charge in and try to figure out a solution, we sometimes lose days in then trying to actually figure out an answer that didn't actually have a correct response. So on the end, I would like to say that I'm actually happy that most of the API documentation we do have to deal with don't provide a lot of problems. And I have to admit that at least for the smaller entities, usually it's well written and we can just let every junior developer deal with it. But there are some that can be a potential problems, and I wanted to bring this to the front. But I can also understand, having written the APIs for internal use, that it is a hard work to actually write a good documentation and to structure the API in the way that it's clear to everybody what it actually does. Thank you for listening. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. That was interesting. A lot of that resonated with me, especially from my time at Swisscom, working with developers and seeing some frustrations. For example, as a developer, if you ever have to pick up a phone, or even if you have to write an email, it's kind of like a terrible thing, right? So you never want to have that situation where you have to actually, call somebody. So having great, developer experience is exactly what you need. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So let's get to those. So from Christoph has asked a question about documentation, right? And which do you prefer? Do you prefer description-based documentation, meaning, Swagger, Open API specification, glossary-based, or more task-based, so use cases with sequence diagrams and so on? Which would be your preference?
Personally, I prefer the first one, but that's generally mostly because we don't deal with the same business cases as the ones that usually write documentation. And I figured out if you know what you're looking for, generally the first one leads to an answer of where I can get the data easier. Also, how would I say, the use cases, I've never actually have a use case when the documentation would really apply there. I mean, how do I say, even in the personal work, even if the use case is similar, I always needed something else to be changed. So I prefer, the first time the Swagger type of documentation, simply for that, for easier searchability and readability. But yeah.
Yeah. I think if you're needing to start, put up things like describing the use case with sequence diagrams, then it's kind of a sign that your API documentation wasn't that good, right? If you have to kind of like supplement it and support it, is something I've seen, several pages of how this thing was put together when you're exposing the complexity of the back end. Better would be to have like just great API documentation that's immediately understandable, right?
Yeah, some documentation are actually so lacking that diagrams in this case help. But it's usually a case of lacking documentation in the other sphere.
Yeah. But I mean, then in that case, at least better to give the developer something, a sequence diagram, so they can kind of say, oh, okay, I see. It's a bit weird, but I get it now. Another question from Christoph, actually. I'm going to kind of split this into two parts. How important do you think are sandboxes for a new API user?
I would say they're appreciated, but not needed. So definitely helps if you can play around and make sure you are not going to destroy the data. But I actually had cases where we pushed in the production the APIs that still have the sandboxes URLs in it. So that's, as long as you have to be then careful of that one. And maybe it helps that we only do the mostly read calls. So I imagine if the use case would be something a bit more destructive, you would want something to test where it would be easier to do. But yeah, so I'd say appreciated, but not needed, at least in my experience.
Right. I guess it's also a little bit depends upon the type of API. So making some financial transaction that you wouldn't necessarily want to do in production. I think some of that stuff you would probably need to sandbox out, right? I could see that. And to pick up the same question again, but how important do you think are Postman collections for a new API user?
I actually have to admit I saw it a lot of times, but we haven't used it a single time in our team.
Okay.
They just...
Well, our next guest is from Postman, so I'm sure he would give you some hints on that. But
Postman is a great developer tool, and we give it to every developer. It's just the collections are not really what we're using. So.
Okay, but have a look. Collections are fantastic. For example, I used Kong recently, and I found the Postman collection for the Kong APIs, and it just made the learning curve so much shorter, right? I was able to, go in, see the APIs, and it's for me, it's easier than reading several pages of documentation. So putting things in collections, I think, is a great idea. If we have time, we have time for a question from my side. Coming back again to that early Swisscom time, 10 years ago or so, we spent so much time on the naming of our API, so the URI design, so how things came together, etc. How important is that? How much effort should you put into that?
Generally, I would say as long as it's descriptive, it's okay. I mean, I would say there were cases where we found out that we can get the data by changing something in the URL, but that was also a case when documentation just haven't catch up to the code and implementation. So in this case, yes, and also better for the pull request, because then you sometimes catch that you're not actually aggregating the data that it is. But besides descriptiveness, I don't actually know if you need to put more in it.
That sounds right. Follow up from Christoph. The main point with public Postman collection is to ensure you keep it up to date and working. That's an interesting add-on. So, yeah, if your collection is public, you must maintain it, right? So that's a good sort of kick to make certain that that's up to date. Thanks, Christoph. One last question from my side is, how can we make sure that we're not making these mistakes? So everything you've just mentioned is like an easy kind of checklist to go through. How can we do that?
That's a good question. If you have an answer, I would like to hear it. So I don't have an answer to that one.
Let's make a checklist. We'll get Mariuka to do it. She's very good at Ozango. They have checklists for different things. So I think we can probably create a checklist of these items in your presentation. But yeah, great. Thank you very much. That was a lovely presentation. And yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you. See you.